This is Democracy Watch. I'm joined by my co-host, voting rights attorney Marc Elias. So, Marc, we've spoken about new Black opportunity districts likely being drawn in Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, Texas, and South Carolina. Now it looks like we have news out of Tennessee. Can you speak on the new lawsuit that was just filed?
Yeah, a new lawsuit in Tennessee by a bunch of civil rights organizations, basically saying that the Republican legislature violated the Constitution when it divvied up Davidson County, which is Nashville, into three congressional districts. It had previously been in one. The net effect of that was to reduce the opportunity of Black voters and citizens to be able to elect their candidate of choice. So a very important lawsuit, and one that we're definitely going to want to watch.
So is this case being litigated then along the same lines as Alabama and Louisiana by using Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act?
No, so this is being litigated under the US Constitution. So if you think of, in one category, you have Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas, where basically the claim is that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act requires the creation of a majority-minority district in order to allow minorities an equal opportunity to elect their candidate of choice. Okay, that's a statutory right under the Voting Rights Act of 1964. There's a second line of cases, though, under the US Constitution, under the 14th Amendment, that says basically you can't discriminate against voters based on race by either cracking them or packing them. And that is what the claim is in Tennessee, is that essentially Republican elected officials, the legislature, knowingly divvied up Black voters into a variety of congressional districts and a couple of state legislative districts in a way to diminish their ability to elect candidates of choice. And that violates the US Constitution.
And is that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution?
It's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. It's the same basic legal theory as what we saw in the South Carolina case we've talked about before, which is going to be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Okay, now what are the implications for Tennessee in terms of seeing that state being ordered to draw new, fairer maps?
So look, if the plaintiffs prevail here, and I think they have a really good chance. I mean, one of the sort of sidelights to all of this is that for all of the talk last term about Allen v. Milligan and Section 2 and the hostility of conservative courts, sometimes to the Voting Rights Act, although we won that case in the Supreme Court. These constitutional challenges actually historically have attracted conservative justices and judges. So conservative justices and judges have typically not wanted to allow state legislatures to divide up people based on race in the way in which alleged here in Tennessee. So if this case prevails, then you would see a new map drawn and almost certainly Nashville reunited, and that would create a district which would be much more heavily African-American and much more Democratic.
Is there any reason to believe that the court would reject this lawsuit?
Look, you never know what a court is going to do, particularly before it hears the evidence. But I think that this is like I said, this is a very strong claim. There really isn't a neutral argument as to why you would take Nashville and divide it into three congressional districts. Right. There's sometimes we use this phrase, traditional redistricting criteria, right? Traditional redistricting criteria, like you try to keep counties together, you try to keep communities of interest together. Well, this doesn't do any of that. This actually divides Davidson County, it divides Nashville, it divides communities of interest, and it heavily fractures the Black community in that county in a way that, to me, looks like it transgresses the 14th Amendment.
Regardless of which way this goes, do you believe that this will be resolved at least before the 2024 election?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. This case will go to a three-judge federal court, which hears these cases. Sometimes when we talk about three-judge panels. Sometimes we talk about one-judge panels. This will be a three-judge panel, and those panels typically move very, very quickly. And I expect this case, we will likely get at least resolution on a temporary basis. In other words, resolution for 2024, I expect we'll get certainly before the end of the year.
Now, I started off by reading like half a dozen states where we're expecting new maps to be drawn. Are there any other states where we should expect more lawsuits challenging the current congressional maps?
Yeah, so you mentioned Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia. I put in one bucket. Those all sort of, to me, follow the Allen v. Milligan line. I expect we'll have new maps in certainly in Alabama and Louisiana, and Georgia goes to trial this fall. I expect similar outcome there. My law firm's involved in all three cases. We've talked a lot recently and read in the news a lot about Florida. That case is now a state case that my firm is involved in, is now focused on one congressional district. This is the
fifth.
former district, Florida 5, held by Representative Al Lawson. I expect that will get resolved this year. Texas, a little bit longer time frame, but could be resolved by the end of this year, hopefully. And then you didn't mention New York. There's a big battle brewing in New York about whether or not the map that was drawn by a Republican judge's special master for the 2022 election, whether that map should be in place for the entire decade, or as the intermediate court in New York has ruled, the bipartisan independent redistricting commission in New York should have to meet its constitutional obligation of presenting the legislature with another redistricting map. My firm won that case in the intermediate court. That case will likely be resolved by the highest court, which is interestingly called the Court of Appeals in New York. But I would definitely be following. I'd definitely be following New York redistricting as well. There's also a case in Utah that I'm watching carefully to see whether or not the Utah Supreme Court orders new maps there.
We're going to dive into a little bit of math here, but what are we looking at in terms of how many seats we could be expected to see either be flipped into opportunity districts or flipped into districts that Democrats have a better shot at winning after having been kind of flipped to the Republican side by virtue of these partisan or political gerrymanders?
Yeah, so Alabama will be an additional Black district, notwithstanding the fact that Alabama keeps violating court orders.
Yeah.
The court will eventually just draw a map, and that'll be one. Tennessee will be a second African-American opportunity district, as will, in my view, I predict, will Georgia. Let's not forget South Carolina, where the NAACP and others are in the U.S. Supreme Court, but won a seat there already that, absent being reversed, will be in place. That's four. Then we just talked about Tennessee. Texas could be, three-ish. And then New York, depending on what a redraw of New York looks like, I've heard independent prognosticators say it could be, 3 to 5, as high as 6 new lean Democratic districts. Those would not necessarily be African American or Latino, but they would probably skew more Democratic.
And then, of course, Florida's fifth, which you were just talking about before. So we could be looking at somewhere in the ballpark of 12 to 16 new seats that Democrats would be favored in, just by virtue of just making this process more fair, just undoing a lot of the unfairness that was wrought by Republicans. To that exact point, we are now looking at districts in all of these different states, all potentially being undone. What's your reaction to the fact that Republicans are currently in the majority in the House because of congressional maps that don't even comply with the law?
It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for democracy. It's a tragedy for voters. I mean, we have a structural system in this country, in the Electoral College and in the U.S. Senate, which is structurally anti-democratic. I don't mean that with a capital D, I mean a small d, right? In that you see people.
Well, I would argue it's also probably, to a degree, structurally anti-big D Democratic.
It's also structurally anti-big D Democratic. And the House, though, is the one branch that is supposed to be very reflective of the will of the electorate. And due to extreme Republican gerrymandering, they have found a way to rig maps to prevent that from being the case. So what it means is that voters in state after state after state have now had to vote and be represented under congressional lines that violate either the U.S. Constitution, federal law, or their state constitutions and state laws. And that is a tragedy for democracy. I think there is no question that in 2024, the chances of Democrats versus Republicans holding the House rests as much on what the courts do in these cases as anything else. And that's because of how badly the Republicans have managed to rig these maps to maintain majority power with a minority of the vote. So let's hope that we have favorable resolutions in these places, and that we have it for 2024, and that we are eventually able to pass federal legislation that will sort of stop all this gamesmanship and allow voters the opportunity to participate in elections and have their votes matter.
Well, that was perfectly put. We'll leave it there. Obviously, thank you to you and your team for all the work you do to protect voting rights across the country, especially with regard to these cases where, again, you're representing a lot of the plaintiffs in these cases. So for anybody watching, if you want to help Marc, then please sign up for Democracy Docket. It's the news outlet that Marc founded to keep you up to date on everything voting and elections. The link is right here on the screen. It's also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.